Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for Gardening for Wildlife Part 2. In this second session, we will be continuing our conversation about how you can create a lovely wildlife habitat at home. My name is Amy Barton, and I work for the Clackamas River Basin Council. I'm joined by my fellow presenters, Susie Cloutier, Lisa Kilders, and Nicole R. from the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, Anya Pickard from the Backyard Habitat Certification Program, Morgan Parks and Gray Sorensen with the National Wildlife Federation, and Eric Butler, who works with me at CRBC.
And congratulations to Gina Lochte. She was our winner of the Mason Bee Box and came to our office last week to pick it up. So Gina, I hope you found a great spot for it and enjoy all those lovely little mason bees.
Yay. All right, guys. Many of us are joining this call from Oregon and Washington, and I'd like to take a moment to recognize that we are gathered on the unceded lands of many Native peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the many communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. We thank those who came before us for their stewardship of these lands and waters, and those who continue to steward them now and into the future. So thanks for that. All right, guys, just some really quick Zoom etiquette. Everyone did a wonderful job in our last session. Just a few reminders to please keep your microphones on mute, and please feel free to leave your cameras off as well so we can reduce our carbon footprint and save bandwidth for our presenters and videos. And if something comes up, no worries, one of our co-presenters can put you on mute as well. All right, briefly with the class format, we will once again be presenting tonight with some live and some recorded segments. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat box and we will read them aloud in the Q&A sessions, which there are 4 of. We will be around for an extra hour after the session as well if you have any more in-depth questions or you would like help with your habitat worksheet shared during the last class. And here is the link to the habitat workshop in the chat now. There you go. I also included the link to the references doc in the chat. Both of these will be sent out via email after the session as well. All right, let's get going.
I'm going to unmute myself here. Hello, everybody. I want to take a minute to talk about pesticides and pesticide reduction. If you look at this graphic, I really appreciate both sides of this. You know, I grew up in a place where that looks a little bit like the left-hand side, where there's a lot of kind of spraying, quaffing, curing, weed and feeding to make everything look neat and tidy. But what we oftentimes don't realize is that what we're doing to make our yards look great are greatly affecting our native world around us, including our water quality. So pesticides include some of the most hazardous chemicals commonly used in and around the home. So products that kill insects, weeds, bacteria, and fungi may be hazardous to children, pets, birds, fish, and other wildlife, and also to beneficial insects like bees and ladybugs. Pesticides used in the yard or at the workplace can be carried outside on shoes and work clothes and mixed with house dust. So young children who crawl on the ground and put objects in their mouths can ingest these chemicals. And think about your pets too, by the way, guys. Aquatic wildlife, including fish, can be greatly affected. Rain and irrigation wash pesticides off of yards and carry them to streams or storm gutters to streams, oftentimes in amounts that can harm salmon or other aquatic organisms that they use as food, like insects. This stuff also kills amphibians and other aquatic animals. So when we see these frogs that are dying off, they pull all of these toxins into their skin, so they're hypersensitive to pesticides. And by the way, when I use the term pesticide, I really mean pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, and insecticide. So all the asides you can think of. Little note about kiddos. In 2009, US Poison Control Centers had over 90,000 incidents related to acute exposures of pesticides alone. That's about 45% involved children under the age of 6. Pets. Many pesticide products are toxic to dogs, cats, and other pets. The risk can be similar to the human health risks as well. Pets with access to treated landscapes may pick up pesticide residues on their paws and fur and lick it or track it into the house. And pets, by the way, can die from slug bait. So I always want to make sure I put that in there. Bees and pollinators. Most insecticides are toxic to beneficial insects, bees and other pollinators. And some pesticides or insecticides, are toxic to birds. Insecticides can kill bees directly when they eat or even just land on treated plants. And I've heard many times people say, well, I want a pesticide that'll kill the bad bugs, but not the good bugs. And I always let them know bad bugs are just something in our head that we've qualified an insect as, so it kills all bugs. Chemical persistence is something we need to look at with pesticides too. So the longer a pesticide remains in the environment, the more likely it is to do damage. So older products like DDT, if you can believe it, are still in the environment and in our bodies almost 40 years after their last uses were banned. So it's very persistent in the environment. Since 2000, water quality monitoring in the Clackamas River Basin has been undertaken by the DEQ. Has detected pesticides that exceed acceptable benchmarks that are healthy for fish and vertebrates and all of the Clackamas tributaries. A great number of these pesticides found in the lower tribs are found in common yard care products as well as commercially used pesticides. In addition to stream health, many garden chemicals also kill our most important beneficial insects, including our already dwindling pollinators, by the way. So when homeowners like you make the decision to stop using pesticides, you help to ensure the long-term improvement of the watershed. I'm going to pass this on next to, I believe, to Anya.
So neonics, short for neonicotinoids. So these are a specific class of chemical that became popular, let's see, probably about 10 years ago now. So neonicotinoids are derived from nicotine. They act on a certain kind of receptor in the nerve synapses. They are much more toxic to invertebrates like insects than they are to mammals, birds, and other higher organisms. Generally, seeds are coated, and that's what you see here in the photo, in the pesticide before they are planted in pots. And as the plant develops, the chemicals move into the leaves, the roots, the pollen, the nectar, and even the food products, if they're fruiting plants, eventually made from that crop of seeds. So it's a systemic additive, meaning that it is within the system of the plant and found throughout the plant. So if insects feed on any part of the plant, even water droplets released by plant leaves, the pesticide, the neonic, it's a neurotoxin, and it can kill or it likely will kill the insect. So in the case of honeybees, if the amount of pesticide ingested isn't strong enough to kill them, it can still cause impaired communication, disorientation, decreased lifespan, suppressed immunity, and disruption of brood cycles. This is one possible link in the terrible chain of events with colony collapse that we're seeing in honeybee populations. This entire class of chemicals has been outlawed in the EU, but not here. And I did look this up before the presentation because some of my information was a couple years old, and we found that they are definitely still legal in the US. Some of you might have heard of the big event that happened in 2013 in Wilsonville. This actually led to Wilsonville becoming a bee city. There was a Target store. The parking lot had some linden trees that had been sprayed for aphids. They used neonicotinoid treatment on the trees. And then literally like the next day was Saturday morning, people were going to do their shopping and bees were falling out of the sky dead. Reports 25 to maybe 50,000 bees, all different kinds of bees, but largely honeybees, a lot of bumblebees too, potentially 150 colonies of bees. So obviously neonicotinoids or neonics, really bad. Most reputable nurseries today do not allow plants that have been treated with neonics. You can see in this photo in the upper left, you can see the little card that got included with the plant. You know, this plant has been protected with neonics from all these bad insects, but it's also an impact for all the beneficial insects that might be present as well. So that's the skinny on neonics. They're really bad.
All right, everyone. So we've just learned a lot about pesticides and all their harm, but there is hope. We all have the power to reduce our own pesticide consumption. And I'll share quickly about our Pesticide Wise and Free program at CRBC. If you live in the Clackamas watershed, you can sign a pretty simple pledge, and we will send you a beautiful yard sign that Morgan designed. And this will share with your neighbors and passerbys that you have a pesticide-free or wise yard. And when I say pesticide-free, that means that you do not use any pesticides on your property. And pesticide-wise means that you use them at the right place, right time, and right way. This can be a good, effective way to get the conversation going with neighbors and encourage others to reduce their pesticides as well. And if you're not sure which watershed you're in, you can put your address into a link from the EPA, which is in your reference doc, which is in the chat, and it will tell you which waterway you are in. This is not only a way to tell if you live in the Clackamas watershed, but it will also tell you the overall health of your waterway. And remember, if you choose to plant natives, you are choosing to plant stuff that needs no additional watering and is pest resistant, so should require no pesticides. Now, if you live outside of the Clackamas watershed, Metro also offers a similar program called the Pesticide Free Zone. I know they had suspended sending out signs temporarily during COVID, but now they are back on board and accepting applications again. And, you know, just looking at this picture, you can see the peace of mind that you will have when you bring your kiddos and your pets into a space that has this sign. You know, it will be safe and poison free. Another similar program is through Beyond Pesticides. So if you're not in the Clackamas watershed or in the metro area, you can go to beyondpesticides.org to purchase any of these 3 really cool signs to show off your amazing pesticide-free yard. These signs can really help change our behaviors at the community level. When people start seeing these signs around their neighborhood, it encourages them to think about their own practices and maybe decide to research more and even follow suit and take the pledge as well. So all of these great programs, the links for all of these is in the reference doc for you.
Okay, so if you have been listening to all of this and Susie talking about all the different kinds of chemicals that we refer to under the umbrella term of pesticides, and you're wondering about some things that might be in your tool shed or garage or have been used in your yard. So the Grow Smart, Grow Safe website is just a really fantastic resource for you. You know, as homeowners or wherever we live, these kinds of chemicals and things can come into our lives sometimes in sneaky ways, all kinds of different sorts of ways. And I've even talked to people who said, you know, their neighbor kindly came over to, you know, weed spray their driveway or whatever it might be. And then you're like, oh no, this chemical was sprayed on my property. What is it? What is the effects of it? So this website is a good resource for you to look these things up. It's a really robust website. I'm just kind of highlighting the chemical aspect here, but there's lots more information. It's from Puget Sound, Thurston County, and you can look up by brand name products or ingredients, and it looks at human health impacts as well as water quality impacts. And it gives a rating, a red zone, yellow zone, or green zone rating. So that is always available to you as a resource should you need it. Okay, next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about stormwater management. We've talked about rain gardens already. We're going to talk about riparian zones more tonight. But stormwater management is a really big deal in the Pacific Northwest because we have very wet winters, obvious to all of us. But that's really different from many other places where winters are cold but dry. Our native plants are really adapted to these particular conditions. So some stormwater management actions that you might take are disconnecting downspouts from stormwater drains. Now, we aren't all connected to the stormwater drains, but many of us are in the more urban environment for sure. Sometimes those are directed directly into a rain garden feature, and we talked a lot about those last time. Water conservation is another way to manage stormwater on site. Restoring soils by leaving leaves and woody debris, adding native plants, and especially large canopy trees. Native plants often have really deep and robust root systems that help water to percolate into the soil. A mature Doug fir can process 40,000 gallons of water in about a 24-hour period. So they are really adapted to these wet winters that we have. And then removing impervious surfaces. So in the context of stormwater management, we consider lawn an impervious surface because it has a really shallow root system. And so it tends to hold the water on the surface and you get that swampy, squishy winter lawn. So it is an impervious surface in this context. So we're moving impervious surfaces and or lawn. And then next slide. So a lot of those that I was just talking about are related to lawn. In this diagram rendering, what you're seeing here are native plants of the prairie land in the middle of our country. So it's just a really fantastic illustration of how deep and robust those root systems are on those native plants. So many of our native plants are like this, but this is the prairie plants. What you're seeing here too, if you look at the very, very left hand of the diagram, that is lawn grass. So you see those really shallow roots compared to those really deep, robust roots. So besides all that, so you're seeing lots of flowers, you're seeing some native bunch grasses. So all of these native plants are doing erosion control. They are sequestering carbon. They're helping with water percolation and that water infiltrating into the soil deeper. They have diverse and robust root systems that also have lots of microorganisms or mycorrhiza, and those all help to process water and move nutrients. This also affects water turbidity, and that helps to clean the water in streams and streamside situations. All of this obviously leads to improved watershed health, and it's no surprise that plants that evolved here have an incredible ability to hold themselves in the ground. They have larger biomasses, and they increase percolation, enhance soil complexity, which also further increases the ability of the soil to hold more water. Okay, I think that's it for the stormwater. So thank you.
All right. Well, we've jumped into one of our question and answer sessions, and I'm just going to go into the chat and see what we have for questions here. So first one is, do we know if neonics are being partitioned to be made illegal at local or state levels anywhere in the US? We have an answer from our group.
I don't know. Somebody else might.
I haven't heard of any movements. Okay, so that might be one where we're going to keep track of the questions, and if we end up with another answer, we'll throw it in there. Good question. So the next one we've got here, is there a reference in these documents that would help plan native plants by season so that your garden has different points of interest each season, as opposed to all plants that are their best in one season? And I think Kim's referring to the document that Morgan placed in there. There's a link for you all of references.
I'm not sure if there is a document in there with the planting through the seasons, but I'm happy to add a document that I have that shows bloom times for all native plants from early spring through late fall. So I'll make sure to put it in if it's not in there.
Yeah, that's a fun one. We'll make sure it's in there. Thanks, Susie. All right, it looks like that's it for questions. So we're going to move into pollination unit with Morgan. Thank you.
Now we're going to talk about pollination. So pollinators are animals that move from flower to flower while searching for protein-rich pollen or high-energy nectar, which is sugar, to eat. Pollinators are essential to the food supply for people as well as for wildlife. As they visit flowers in search of food, they are dusted by pollen and move it to the next flower, fertilizing the plant and allowing it to reproduce and form seeds, berries, fruits, and other plant foods that form the foundation of the food chain for other wildlife species, including humans. So pollination can occur by air, water, and organisms with agents like wind, rivers, insects, and birds. There are several types of pollination. Self-pollination occurs on the same flower or flowers of the same plant. Cross-pollination is between flowers on different plants. And then there's artificial pollination, which is by hand or man-made. Pollinators are critical for pollinating 1/3 of our agricultural crops, the food that we eat, which amounts to between 235 to 577 billion US dollars, which just goes to show how important they are for continued life on Earth. Next slide. There are many different types of pollinators. In North America, bees, butterflies, moths, and some species of beetles, wasps, and flies are pollinators, along with hummingbirds and 2 species of bat. Even people affect pollination through our behaviors, such as transporting seeds. An easy way to remember all the pollinators is just to remember the bees. Bees, butterflies, birds, bats, bugs, and behaviors. In the chat window, we'll put some additional tips for attracting pollinators. Next slide. One of the ways to attract specific pollinators is through flower petal colors. For instance, bees are attracted to violet blue colors, while hummingbirds like reds and oranges. We also know that pollinators prefer dense clusters and clumps of the same plant, so be sure to plant in groups so they can see large landing zones of color. When you plant every other, like yellow, red, yellow, red, yellow, red, even though it might look pretty and uniform, it's not natural. So always try to think of how Mother Nature would do it, which is often messy and chaotic, but teeming with life. So just remember that flowers clustered into clumps of one species and the same color will attract more pollinators than individual plants scattered through a habitat patch. Next slide. Other characteristics that attract different species are what's called pollinator syndromes. These are flower characteristics, traits, or cues that appeal to various pollinators. It's important to have a variety if you want to attract diverse pollinators. For example, bees don't see the color red. It's invisible to them as they see ultraviolet light. They also like landing platforms and nectar guides. So nectar guides are patterns like speckles, dots, or stripes on the throat of a flower. Short-tongued bees like flowering herbs, while long-tongued bees prefer tubular flowers. Beetles like odors and simple flowers with an open bowl shape that are dull white or reddish in color. Flies like small, shallow flowers in drab colors, think brown, purple, and with a bad odor. Butterflies are generalists, and they like perching platforms. They like a light scent and composite type flowers. Moths like strong and sweet smells, flowers that open in the late afternoon and evening, and clusters of white pale flowers that they can see in the dark. So in summary, if you're not seeing the pollinators you want to see, think about pollinator preferences when selecting plants for your yard. Next slide. This is a resource I like, which we'll put in the chat window, as it's a good reminder to plant blooming species that attract beneficial insects throughout the growing season. Overlapping flowering times provide continued forage throughout the year. As you can see, pink or red flowering currant is getting ready to bloom right now, which some of you have been seeing in your yards. Others like Oregon grape, Oregon iris, and red osier dogwood will be blooming later this spring. And something like Oregon sunshine can benefit insects into the late summer. A new website that you should definitely check out is Oregon Flora. We'll put that in the chat window too. This is essentially a database of native plants, which you can filter by plant needs, plant features, growth and maintenance, ecoregion, and habitat type. You can even search by what type of pollinators you're trying to attract. So be sure to check that out. Next slide. As bees are our most important and efficient pollinators, and wild flowering plants rely on them for pollination and reproduction, it's important to create bee-friendly gardens, as we have over 4,000 native bees in North America. In the chat window, we'll share the Bee-Sponsible Outreach Toolkit for municipalities to help spread the word about the importance of bees, the challenges they face, and the actions your fellow community members can take to help. Pollinators are declining worldwide due to various factors that several of us has mentioned already, including habitat loss, pesticides, disease, land use changes, and climate change. The once common rusty patched bumblebee, which was recently listed as endangered in the United States, and the beloved monarch butterfly, which has declined by 99% in the West, are examples of species on the brink of extinction. To show your commitment to bees, display a pollinator sign, such as those from Victory Garden of Tomorrow, which Adam already mentioned earlier. This is a local Portland company that makes various attractive garden signs featuring pollinators and other wildlife. Another great option is the Xerces Society's pollinator habitat sign, which is also very attractive. And one last thing to remember as far as bee habitat is to be sure to keep areas of undisturbed soil and grassy patches in your yard, as many bees build their nests either in the ground, in rodent burrows, grass clumps, dead snags, or rotting logs.
So tonight we're going to have a crash course in beneficial insects. Next, please. I'd like to give a special thanks to Gwendolyn Ellen, who put together the original presentation. She's retired from OSU Integrated Plant Protection Center. Next. So is this you? Do you just hate bugs? You just think they all should be dead? Well, I had similar thoughts too until I started learning more about them. They're actually very, very fascinating. And I think you're going to enjoy looking at insects a lot more after this. Next. So why do we want beneficial insects? Well, obviously, these insects help control garden pests without the use of pesticides. The habitat that we create for beneficial insects are beautiful, and they provide habitat for pollinators and other birds. And then we have the increased in beneficial insect populations, and those insects are eaten by birds. So we're providing food for birds. Next. So do you know the difference between garden pests and the beneficial insects? We don't want you to be killing off the good guys while you're trying to kill off the bad guys. So if you look on the left, you see the common garden pests that we have: scales, caterpillars, aphids, spider mites. On the right side, you will see some of our beneficial insects. You might know the ladybugs, but you may not recognize the parasitic wasp, the tachinid fly, the hoverfly. You might know the ground beetle and maybe know the lacewing. They're a beautiful insect. Next. Okay, there are 3 functional groups of beneficial insects. The predators, they go through life gorging themselves on pests. And they include insects like ground beetles, aphids, not aphids, ground beetles, lacewings, hoverflies, soldier beetles, and ladybugs. And then we have parasitoids, the parasitic wasps and the tachinid flies, and they lay their eggs on or in the garden pests. And it's that developing insect, that the larvae, that is the one that does the battle with the garden pests. And later on, I'm going to show you some very cool video on that. So, and then we have pollinators, which we've already talked about. While pollinators are very necessary for production of food, we're not going to talk about them tonight because they're not a natural enemy of our garden pests, with the exception of hornets and yellow jackets. And they provide very, very minor pollination benefits, but they will in fact prey on pests like grasshoppers and caterpillars. So as much as we hate the yellow jackets, they do a little good. Next. So predators do need prey to survive. So we have to talk about the tolerance levels. You have to have a good source of food for these beneficial insects to survive. So don't expect your garden to be insect free. Because when you do have a major outbreak of garden pests, you need your beneficial army ready to go and do battle. However, you must realize that control does not happen overnight. So you have to expect that insect activity, good and bad, is in your garden. You also have to decide on your tolerance level when you do have a major outbreak. Look and see before you spray if you have beneficial insects present, and that requires some scouting. Best time to scout is between 10 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. They don't like it when they are too cold in the morning and they go to bed early. So between 10 and 3, be out there looking. You can also, then if you see them, don't spray. If you have beneficial insect activity, it takes them a while, but they will take care of it. If you have an outbreak that is so large, you just cannot possibly wait for the beneficials to take care of it. Use something that is going to be hopefully not so harmful to your beneficial insects. Use things that are listed for your specific insect. Don't use a broad spectrum spray, and use things like Safer Soap, or prune out the insects, the branches that have the insects on them. Do some type of cultural thing to try to get rid of the insects if you can. So it's just a good way to make sure that you're not killing the good guys with the bad. Next. So here is where our garden habitat is going to come into play. For the beneficial insects whose larvae attack the garden pests, you must make sure that the adults have food to reproduce, and those are the ones that use pollen and nectar to give them the energy to lay their eggs, and then the larvae are the ones that are going to do the work. And so this means you have to have flowers available from early spring to late fall. And if you look on here, if you see the ladybug on the far right, and just below that, that is a larvae of a ladybug. You might see aphids and think, oh my gosh, I got aphids, and now I have this thing that looks like from outer space, and I don't know what that is. It's probably another pest, but it's not. That is an aphid. Not an aphid, ladybug larvae, and they are murder on aphids. They will just gorge themselves. The same thing with the beautiful lacewing in the center. The larvae there to the left, I think that one's called the aphid lion because they eat so many aphids. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Parasitoids. We've already talked about the predators. Now we're going to talk about parasitoids. These also need to have nectar and pollen to survive because the adults need that energy to reproduce, and their offspring do feed on the pests. The one on the left, the parasitic wasp, they will lay their eggs inside the insect, but the one on the right, the tachinid fly, lays their eggs on top. So you see the caterpillar on there. If you see caterpillars and they have these white things on them, the eggs, don't kill that caterpillar. That's where the beneficial insect has laid its eggs. It's going to kill that insect, and then that insect, those new beneficial insects will hatch, and they'll go out and kill more bad insects out there. Next. Oh, yay. This is the fun part.
This is another time when you want to scout to make sure you have beneficial insects. If you have an aphid infestation and you see aphid mummies, then you know that you have beneficial insects there working hard. An aphid mummy are the bloated ones to the right. They're the bloated gray or white aphid bodies. If you watch this video on the left, that is a parasitic wasp. The ovipositor has the stinger has evolved into an ovipositor, and that unsuspecting aphid is having an egg inserted into it. Then that egg will start hatch and it will kill that aphid. And here is an adult parasitic wasp that's going to emerge from that aphid body. So if you'll see, sometimes they'll be white and gray. Here on the left-hand side, these finally going to come out, and these full adults, so it will fly off to insert an egg into another aphid and kill that aphid. And all these videos are from Dr. Stephen Rotten, and he is the king of beetle banks from New Zealand. So he is also a very good photographer. Okay, next. So to be successful, you have to think like an insect. You want to, where would you go to get away from pesticides or soil disturbances? In perennial beds, that's a great place to have beneficial insect habitat because you don't dig up the soil every year. You're not disturbing it. They're clump grasses like fescue and miscanthus, fountain grass or pennisetum and switchgrass. They have good bases for insects to hide in, and they're high and dry. They're up off the ground a bit. They're perfect for overwintering ground beetles. You want to make sure there's food. There's some kind, so there's a population of pests that are growing all year long. So you also want to make sure you have something flowering to feed those adults that will produce the next crop of beneficial insects. And then you want to provide water. Water is, when we're talking about a water source, we're not talking about pools. I don't know how many of you have seen dead insects in pool that tried to land and drink, but they usually drown. Bird baths, small divots in landscape rocks or saucers that are shaded and have water for even part of the day will work. If you have a bird bath, be sure to add a branch that's large enough for insects or even a small bird to land on, and they can work their way down to the water. That way they can safely drink. Some of these bird baths are beautiful, but they're smooth and they may not provide good footing for the insects or the birds. Even sprinkling foliage in the morning, that foliage will be wet for a while, and that will provide water for your beneficial insects. Here's something else to think about. I think, do we go to the next one here? Next? Yep. Something else to think about. In the fall, when we're a bit tired, we have already talked about planting for continuous spring through fall flowering. Plant for a range of heights. You want to think like shrink down to insect size. Are there ground covers? Are there tall flowers and shrubs, mid-layer flowers? Want to have those different layers for different insects. And then because the beneficial insects that do use the pollen and nectar are so small, you want to pay attention to the shape of the flower. They need to be small and they need to exist in clusters. It's kind of like having a fast food restaurant on every corner. They won't have far to fly to get to the next food source. And so they're small, they don't fly very far. Go for flowers that are flattish and have an easily accessible pollen and nectar. Tubular flowers are great for hummingbirds, but they don't offer anything for beneficial insects. Next, and of course, grow in blocks that we talked about before so that there's a number together and they can see them. So let's talk about plants. There are three main types of flowers that are most useful for beneficial insects. First is the carrot family. The carrot family have the umbel flowers like this Angelica here, and they have many flowers close together, so the small insects do not have to fly very far for their next meal. Mustard flowers, those are their eurysimums, your mustards, your arabis or rock crests that are beautiful early spring blooming flowers in perennial flowers actually in rock gardens or garden borders. And then we have asters. They are, of course, asters or some sunflowers, chrysanthemums, the daisy type of mums, and marigolds even. And these are fall, summer and fall bloomers. So you have these types of flowers that are available for your beneficial insects and your different seasons that you usually see them blooming. The common denominator is a small, simple flower that has nectar and pollen, and that's very accessible to the beneficial insects that require those. Next. So go forth and make your garden beautiful and noisy with beneficial insects.
All right, that was exciting. We're moving into some more question and answer session here. And it looked like we had a couple pop up. So I'm going to start with the first one. Alina asked, is there a lawn alternative ground cover that has deeper roots, but still soft underfoot? And that's a tough question. Do we have any takers?
I know that there is some eco lawns. I don't know what their root systems are like, and they have a mixture of different plants. But I think that they're probably more lawn-like than some other plants, but I really don't know about the root system. Suze?
Yeah, I don't know about the root systems so much, but the some of those eco lawns contain low-growing flowers for pollinators, and I have some remnants on my farm too. They seem to be pretty persistent and put up with a lot of footsteps. But you know, the one thing that I am thinking about is potentially some low-growing native bunch grasses that may be good options as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. All right, we have another question. And that one is, what type of shelters from pesticides are recommended for folks who live in apartments where spraying is done by lawn maintenance and is out of their control?
Well,
You know,
go ahead, Susan.
I have thoughts about, you know, apartment complexes or any of these places with community gathering spots, is that kind of like paying with your pocketbook or voting with your pocketbook. We should, as residents of apartments or condo complexes, have some sort of say on, you know, what the groundskeepers are using, or at least try to have some positive influence on that by talking to management. I truly don't know what you can do if management's not, you know, willing to listen to, you know, to feedback as far as not using pesticides. Did I understand that question right, or do I need to look at that again?
I think you understood it properly. I would just add that if you have plants, you know, out that you can move away, like potted plants, when you know they're going to be treating in the landscape, you could move them in.
Yeah, and I would also just second, you know, asking the question and just giving feedback that it's important to you. Anecdotally, I would just share that there's a retirement community that I work with that they had a lot of people really interested in this issue. I mean, a lot of these issues, you know, sustainable gardening and all of that. And they gave so much feedback and so much pushback to the management of the overall community that it really changed a lot of their practices. So definitely voice your concerns and opinions and ask questions, but try to be part of the solution if you possibly can.
This warrants a comment as well, briefly about anybody that's using a garden maintenance company themselves. I know when I was working with Backyard Habitat, I'd ask homeowners, you know, who's taking care of the gardens and do they spray? And a lot of people didn't know. They made a grand assumption that their garden care company didn't spray, but they had vast amounts of brown dirt underneath their shrubs. So know what's being used around you.
All right, well, I think that covers the questions this time. Now we're going to move into a break. So we have about 7 minutes. Go ahead and do what you need to do to take a break, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
And I am going to have one poll for you all, and I'm just going to leave this poll open for the next 7 minutes. So feel free to take your time. And then when we come back, we'll go ahead and review our results together.
I don't see any for education one. It might just be another thing. Yeah. 549 is there. Finding it. 549. Snippet.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone had a very good break, eating, drinking, restrooms, pet feeding, whatever you did. Wanted to commend everyone on the managing your lawn answers to the break poll. What is the worst thing to add to your lawn? And 94% of you got it right. Weed and feed is the worst thing you can add to your lawn. And that can come as quite a shock to a lot of folks, but keep in mind that when you add a weed and feed product, you're actually applying herbicides to your entire lawn, even where no weeds are present. So most lawns have 5 to 10% weeds over the lawn area. So that means that when you're adding weed and feed to 100% of the lawn area, you're over adding herbicide completely. So what's recommended is spot weed treating. Also, I want to bring up a couple of other things, and that is that weed and feed contains atrazine, which is toxic to trees and shrubs over the long haul. So in the last class, we talked about chemical persistence. This is a very persistent chemical, so it can eventually lead to the death of your trees and shrubs after regular use. The other thing is it's bioaccumulative, so it can cause cancer, immunological and neurological issues in both humans and pets. And lastly, all plants need beneficial fungi in order to thrive. And these products actually harm this important beneficial fungi in the long run. So it really behooves us to get away from the weed and feed and do any kind of like very directed spot treatments that we may need to do. So good job, everyone.
All right, next we have Eric speaking about wetlands and riparian areas.
Also known as so you have water on your property. The next slide, please. So there is no universally accepted definition of what a wetland is, but for legal purposes and really pretty descriptive of most of what we encounter, wetland is an area that under normal conditions has enough water to support plants adapted to live in saturated soils. It's important that you highlight those three things because if you have a wetland, that's how you know. You look at all three of those factors. You look at the wetland, look at the water, you look at the soils, and you look at the plants together. A riparian area, on the other hand, is simply an area that's influenced by a river or stream. And riparian areas can contain wetlands or vice versa. And both of those can be either perennial or seasonal. You can have wetlands that will dry up during the hot, dry part of the summer, but they'll still be entirely functional as wetlands during the wet part of the year. Next. So wetlands and riparian areas are incredibly important parts of the landscape. They're very valuable. They're highly diverse, complex, and productive ecosystems, much more so than either open water or dry land. Wetlands are what are an example of what's called an ecotone. They're a transitional space between two different types of ecosystems where you get a lot of complexity that rises from the meeting of those two different systems. And wetlands and riparian areas contain many unique and important species. They're also very resilient. They're very important for protecting water quality and quantity. They absorb floodwaters, and they can even interrupt wildfires by providing very green, lush, wet spaces on otherwise dry landscapes. Wetlands are imperiled. Less than 5% of the historical wetlands that were in the Willamette Valley still exist, and most of those are degraded. And there are several dependent species, or several species that depend very specifically on having wetland habitats that are conservation priorities at various levels, all the way up to being listed under the Endangered Species Act. And finally, wetlands are protected. The Clean Water Act contains a provision requiring that impacts to wetlands are mitigated. So if you are doing some sort of construction project that's going to result in a wetland being filled or degraded or otherwise impacted, you have to offset that. You have to do some sort of project that's going to protect or improve a wetland either on site or elsewhere. And there are also, again, many species that are listed at the state or federal level for conservation that depend on having wetland habitats. And so that can be even another avenue for protecting wetlands. Next. Now there are a lot of different steps in caring for wetlands in terms of either restoring wetlands that have been degraded or protecting the wetlands that are already in good shape. So you really want to think about protecting the hydrology and restoring that. That's what the water is doing on the landscape, both how it's flowing across the surface, how it's either moving or being held up, and also about how water is interacting with the groundwater, where there are opportunities for the surface water to move back into the groundwater, where groundwater is coming back up to the surface. All of the cycling is very important for the function of the wetland and for the benefits of water quality and quantity. Also have to think about protecting soils. So whether you're doing work to reestablish a nice shallow gradient on what had been a previously very channelized kind of canyoned out stream, or if you're just kind of doing work to prevent erosion, putting down jute netting or something like that, you can see in this top right picture. You have to manage invasive species. Wetlands, being these very complex productive ecosystems, also have a lot of invasive species that are very special to them. And finally, it's really worth doing a lot to establish and conserve native plants that are in the landscape. As again, you're thinking about the water, think about the soils, and you're thinking about the plants and how those all interact with each other. Next. And so, because wetlands are these protected landscapes, if you're going to do work in wetland, do you need a permit? So in the example of the left, you can see here that there's a construction project that has essentially removed the wetland from existence. So in this case, you not only need to get a permit, but you also need to do mitigation. You have to do something to protect and enhance the wetlands, either next to the site or somewhere else in the landscape. And often these mitigation requirements could be much more than the acres that you've removed. So it might be something like you impact 1 acre of wetland, you agree to offset that with 5 acres of mitigation. In the middle example, this is a case where you're kind of breaking the system to fix it. This might be a stream that formerly was very channelized, very cut off from its floodplain. It's just running through a gully and just the water's moving through the landscape very fast. And so in this case, you're putting in a lot of rocky material, you're redoing the banks, you're doing a lot of work to change the movement of the water and the shape of the land. And so this is having an impact on the wetland in the riparian area in the short term, but because it is providing a long-term benefit, you do need to get a permit to do the work, but it's considered self-mitigating because the work you're doing is providing a net benefit. And on the right, if you're just doing something like planting native plants, or if you're removing weeds, or if you're just putting down something on the surface like mulch or jute netting or something, control the erosion, that's not really changing the structure of anything. And so that's a case where you don't need a permit, because what you're doing here isn't causing any harm. It's simply creating a benefit to the wetland. Next. And Oregon is the beaver state. We are famous for having a lot of beavers around here, even in very urbanized landscapes, where you have moving water that's not too steep and where you have woody vegetation. Beavers are very likely to show up, even if just for a short time. And so beavers are very good things for wetlands. They are what are called ecosystem engineers. They create levels of complexity and levels of biodiversity and functional benefits for the wetlands that would not exist without them. However, they're also potentially nuisances to us. Sometimes they chew on our favorite ornamental plants, so they knock down the trees we just put in. They can raise the water table, which might end up flooding your basement or flooding part of our lawn or things like that. And so there definitely are issues that come with beavers moving into areas where there isn't necessarily enough space to fit them. And so there are ways to help us coexist that don't require us trying to demolish the dams or trap the beavers out, especially because that isn't a sustainable solution. If there's good habitat for the beavers, they will keep showing up. So removing them is only a temporary solution. A much better solution is to use things like pond levelers or tree protection or putting caging over culverts, just various steps to kind of mitigate the impacts that the beavers might be having to the infrastructure we have. And so that way it's a lot easier to live with them rather than having to live against them. And yes, beavers do get along quite well with ducks. Next. But you don't have water, you're saying. Water is good anywhere in the landscape. I mean, even something as small as a bird bath or a bubbler or a little dish that you set out with water, even just a little mud pit. Anything that creates a source of water on the landscape is beneficial to wildlife. These do require maintenance though, so you don't want to let the water go stagnant. You don't want to have areas where mosquitoes might be breeding. You want to keep bird baths and things like that clean and sanitary so you don't end up with disease problems. But as long as you're willing to put in a little bit of work, and it's not a whole lot of work that's required, but providing any source of water in the landscape is going to be a positive. Next. And we're here to help. Your local watershed council or your local soil and water conservation district, we are both great resources for doing any sort of help with doing work in wetlands or riparian areas. So if you have water on your landscape and you want to do something to improve it, but you don't know where to start, reach out to us. And that's what I have. I think we have a poll next.
All right, thanks, Eric. I do have a really brief poll for you all. Let me pull this up for you right now. And we'll give everyone just about 30 seconds or so just to pop in their answer. So the question, do you have naturally occurring water on your property? Yes, no, or not sure? Okay. Looks like we've got almost everybody so far. Okay.
That's really cool that so many people do.
Yeah.
Does rain count?
So it looks like we've got, well, most people don't, but a lot of people do. So that's great to see. You can take some of these tips that we've learned from Eric and try to improve that nice riparian habitat that you've got going on. All right, everybody. Let's move on here.
Okay, so firescaping. This is a new segment that we've added for this session, and this is going to be a quick, about 6 minutes on firescaping. So initial considerations for firescaping and fire protection on your property are things like local area fire history, site location, overall terrain, prevailing winds, seasonal weather, property contours and boundaries, native vegetation, which can be a help, and then other plant characteristics, as well as any irrigation available or required. So the big takeaway here is that topography really matters. In the urban and suburban setting, I think we really tend to think about our property as in a microcosm, but we live in this physically connected environment, and it's important to think about that and to think about that context. So slopes mean there's an opportunity for fire to burn vertically, and that is a much higher risk since fire burns hotter and faster in a vertical setting. So fire needs three things: fuel, terrain, and weather. So terrain, the steep slopes particularly, but also thinking about grasslands or meadows, and then weather, windy and dry. So protecting from prevailing winds in fire season is something that some of you might consider. So in the context of firescaping, there's a lot of information, and I was looking at the FireWise website a lot, and a lot of different kinds of FireWise information, firewise.org, and there'll be several links in the resources page that we're going to send you guys later. For larger properties, there is a zone concept that is applied where zone 1 is closest to the structure, and then zones 2, 3, and 4 move progressively further away from the structure. That really pertains more to larger properties and more rural environments, because there you're talking about creating a well-irrigated or inflammable area close to the house, and maybe up to 30 feet away from structures, and also allowing for space for fire suppression equipment or emergency equipment to get into that 30 feet kind of zone around a structure. Obviously, in the more urban and suburban environment, that's not going to make be as applicable. Next slide, please. So our focus here is going to be about reducing fuel. That is that's kind of the key takeaway from this, is that the goal is to reduce fuel for fires to burn. So 3 different ways that we can focus on doing that: building a defensible space around the house and other structures. So we're talking about a fuel-free zone, maybe within 3 to 5 feet. That's the FireWise prescribed area, but maybe even as much as 5 to 10 feet around your home's perimeter. And that would also include any attachments like decks or other buildings or structures, arbors. This is an area where nothing will burn. It is a fuel-free zone. So including things like bark mulch, shrubbery, trees, maybe even wooden patio furniture. You want to remove any tree branches that hang over the roof or are within 10 feet of your chimney. Widely space and carefully situate any trees that you plant on your property. Removing dead or dying plants, raking up needles and leaves and other debris. Storing firewood further away from the house. And then considering fire sprinklers for structure perimeters as a fire break. And that irrigation could be used to help create that fire break during risky times. Fire resistant materials. So here we're talking about, again, that fuel break. So that could include things like driveways, gravel walkways, well irrigated lawn or meadow, and any kind of hardscape, and then avoiding bark mulch, maybe even considering bare earth. Replacing fire-prone plants with FireWise species, and there's a link to more information about low-risk or high-risk plants. OSU has a really great guide for that. Usually we're focusing more on deciduous plants rather than conifers, removing vines, shrubs, and scrub that are undergrowth beneath trees, and creating open spaces under trees to avoid the ladder effect that can just the fire can sweep right up into the tree. Removing noxious weeds that form thickets, any of you that might have blackberry hedges, and any dead or dying plants, and then avoiding hedgerows near structures. When it comes to maintenance, we're talking about thinning out trees to keep the tree canopy from touching each other or structures, obviously. And part of that is anticipating the mature size of the trees. So really, again, doing some planning in advance of planting. Keeping trees and shrubs properly pruned, whatever that means in this context. We want to prune trees so that the lowest limbs are 6 to 10 feet. Another source I looked at said 10 to 15 feet from the ground. Removing leaf clutter, dead and decaying branches and other debris, cleaning your roofs, gutters in the summertime, mowing the lawn regularly, and then disposing of all of that debris promptly and according to local regulations if you were in a fire-prone area. Being sure that your irrigation system is well maintained and functional. Also thinking about equipment and chemicals, making sure that flammable liquids are properly stored, and following manufacturer's instructions when it comes to fertilizers and other kinds of pesticides, chemicals, and then disposing of smoking materials carefully. So that might mean if you have a fire pit outside or a fireplace inside, being sure that those things are completely out. And then finally, water access. So perhaps adding multiple hose bibs around your property or around your structures. You could also have a water feature. It could be like a pond or a pool. And you want to have a non-electric pump if you want to be able to access that water and use that water for emergency irrigation, because often the power goes out when you're in an emergency situation. And then becoming familiar with local regulations regarding vegetation clearances, disposal of debris, fire safety requirements for equipment, and then also really knowing your neighbors. You never know when you're going to need them, and thinking about cleanups in your community, and that helps everybody. And then finally, I just want to say that a lot of these things go completely against other things that we've been talking about that are beneficial for wildlife in this class. So things like leaving the leaves, dead and declining, branches and trees, not irrigating, bark mulch, all of those things. Obviously, each homeowner needs to decide what makes sense for their location and their comfort level. So these are just some guidelines. And like I said, several links, and the FireWise landscaping checklist is also a real great beneficial thing for you guys. Great, thank you. I think we have a short poll here now too on firescaping.
Yes, we have one short poll. Let me go ahead and tee that up for you guys. There it is. Okay, so the question, what are vital fire prevention landscaping practices? We've got clear away leaves near the house, mulching planting beds with gravel, irrigate lawn in hot weather, utilize hardscaping around structures, or plant trees away from structures. We'll give everyone just about maybe 20 or 30 more seconds to pop their answers in here.
I originally had a fun kind of answer in here too about topiary pruning, but it was just a funny thing.
All right, let's go
Lots
ahead.
of different choices there. So obviously all of these are appropriate in fire prevention or firescaping. All of these are good practices. So thanks everyone for listening to my short little talk about firescaping.
All right. Well, we're moving into some more question and answers. And I think Anya kind of touched on some of these, but I'll just hop right in here. So one of the questions we got was, sometimes it seems like firescaping and naturescaping are opposite approaches to landscaping. What might be a good middle ground for trying to accomplish both? And that is a good observation.
I can jump in here. Think about the season. You can leave your leaves in the flower bed in the fall and winter. It's wet. You're probably not going to have a wildfire. And by the time you get back in there in the spring, a lot of them will be decomposed. So you're still getting the benefit of your organic matter, but by then you could probably rake up anything that's left over if you have to, if you're afraid that it's going to dry up. But think about the season. I think in the wintertime you're going to be safe.
Yep, and defensible space is a big one too. You know, you could still have your hedgerow, you can still have your trees, and maybe you're just moving those things further away from your house or structures, and have that defensible space around your actual home. And like I said, to irrigation that can be used, you know, as an emergency measure potentially. There's lots of ways to kind of adapt things, but you're right. A lot of this is in direct conflict with what we've talked about, and you know, in some ways, this plays into some of the real traditional indigenous ways of doing fire prevention through small fires, so that we don't have these big, huge wildfires. Yeah, it's a big topic, and we just covered it really quickly.
Yeah, and I will add that Lisa put there in the chat a fire resistant plant list, and we can put that in our resources to share with everyone.
It's already there.
One more, go ahead.
All my
Anya.
fire saving links are all in the resources page. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I'll just add too that I think we mentioned this in the last class, but some of this work where we remove vegetation off of our homes can also help with rodents getting into the foundation and up on the roof and crawling through things. So there might be other benefits to not having plants right up on your home. Okay. So I also saw we have a comment in here from Suzanne. Some people say keep dead leaves in flower beds, but this says not to. A friend has a mulcher, but the material has to be dry, not appropriate for Portland. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah,
think, again, seasonal. Oh, go ahead.
Like I said, it could be seasonal. It can be just where are you leaving the leaves? You know, maybe, like I said, maybe it's just having that defensible space around the house, and instead of using leaves or bark mulch, using, you know, gravel as a mulch around the house instead, and moving those leaves somewhere else where it's not putting your home at risk. Yeah, and a lot of this depends on, you know, where you live, what your site is like, what your, you know, there's so many factors that you need to consider here.
Great. Yeah, so that was all the questions that I saw there. We're going to move into Anya, talking about habitats.
So let's talk about habitat zones and plant communities. I want to start here because I think, you know, as I was sort of saying in the Q&A after the break, it's a little more complex than just thinking about, you know, shade is moist and sun is dry. There's a lot more going on. So in these photos, these are all photos from our Portland metro area. So those are some real life situations. I want to really direct your attention and encourage you to look at the Portland plant list, which we've talked about before, and look at the plant communities section. So there's a whole chapter on the different plant communities. There are basically 9 different habitat zones. Basically, these habitat areas have plant communities that are associated with them that evolve together. So those plant communities exist with different species that are used to growing together and have an association. So these different areas might include Douglas fir Western hemlock forest, mixed deciduous coniferous forest, oak prairie, wetlands, floodplains, and rocky outcroppings. That's some of them. These are based on conditions. So what you'll read about in the Portland plant list is based on conditions from the mid-1800s. And I feel like it may require us to have some kind of adaptive thinking about our current urban and suburban conditions. So when we think about things like pavement and reflected heat, or pedestrian and canine traffic and that kind of abuse that our plants get, street clearances, visibility, you know, these kinds of things. So kind of adapting some of those historic conditions and thinking about how our current situation applies. So one example we've talked about is wetland areas that we've adapted into our rain gardens and our bioswales. So that's one way of kind of adapting how a habitat area or a plant community might get utilized in our environment. Another one, we often think about a lot of this forest land that was historically here in the Portland area. And I like to direct people to think about maybe the forest steep, dry slope, because the urban and suburban kind of woodland areas are so much drier because they're hotter, warmer, and just drier. So I think that's another way that we can kind of adapt one of these historic habitat zones and look at it through the lens of our current situation. And then also, you know, there's urban heat island effect. I've just talked about that. The east side versus west side temperature differences, which I talked about earlier. And then, you know, some people are looking at more Northern California plans, Eastern Oregon plans. That can get a little tricky. I've certainly looked at some of those plants myself because we do have really, really wet winters. And some of those plants from those drier zones where there's more snow, or just drier climate, more arid climates, are not adapted to the wet winters, and they can suffer from rot. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little more specifically about conditions in your yard. So these are all photos from my yard, and you can see quite a bit of sun. I think that left photo must have been a shady or cloudy day, because that's a pretty sunny area too. But you can see some situations, right? On the left, you see reflected heat potentially from the house. So that's stucco. There's a lot of heat going to be reflected off the house. In that middle photo, you've got another kind of little microclimate. So ways in which we affect our situation, affect the conditions through our activities. So I talked about some of the negative ones with pedestrian, canine traffic, things like that. But here, you know, I have a bird bath. I'm filling that on a regular basis. So that creates this moist area around that as a result. And those plants are doing well, despite some really hot sun that's coming in there. And then in the right photo, you see a lot of pavement and a stone wall. So again, a lot of reflected heat. It's a very hot location. So it's really important to think about the bigger picture, but also, you know, even at the neighborhood scale, slope, flow of water, proximity to creeks, waterways, highways, things like that. And then the more microclimate situation of our yards. What are the situations in our spaces, the different features around our yards. In the next slide, yep. So again, these are all photos from my yard. So different kinds of plants that we might choose that are native as a substitute for a common ornamental plant. So some that I like to highlight are things like hydrangeas, substituting a mock orange, which is a great native. Red flowering currant is a wonderful substitute for butterfly bush. Native spirea, we have 2 locally native spirea. I think the many people plant the japonica spirea, which has a pink flower. Our birch leaf spirea is very, very similar, but has a white flower instead. A lot of feather grasses and ornamental grasses are really popular right now. We have some great fescues, roamer's fescue, tufted hairgrass. Those are great native bunch grasses that really offer great habitat. I think I had a picture there. You see my evergreen huckleberry. That's a great substitute for boxwood. Evergreen huckleberry can absolutely be hedged if you want to do that. Epimedium or coral bells, substitute inside out flower or fringe cups, which you see in the middle photo. Also foam flower, there is a native heuchera, the alum root or piggyback plant. Those are all really similar related families of plants that look really similar to coral bells. Pyrrhus or Andromeda, that's a common ornamental shrub. I love snowberry instead. You see my snowberry there blooming, and I can't believe how many hummingbirds are attracted to those little tiny flowers. So I mentioned earlier, choose resilient plants that are the right plant for the specific location. Take into consideration, be realistic about how much care you're going to give them. Perhaps consider irrigation, even if it's for the first couple of years, just to help them get established. Start off plants right with amendment, mycorrhiza, and definitely planning for some deep watering weekly for any trees or large shrubs. I encourage people to plant the biggest tree they have room for, but definitely consider both the height as well as the breadth or the spread of the tree. The Portland Plant List has great information on trees. Even the larger trees, they have not just a mature height and spread, but also a 10-year height and spread. So you get an idea of what it's going to be like after a little while, but not mature yet still. Planting trees is a great way to also help create shade. And I think that creating shade is a great way to decrease maintenance in your yard. In the second photo there, you see a mix of different native ground covers. When you have more shade, you can have these dense plantings with lots of woodland native ground covers. I love to use a mix of different ground covers that are going to spread and fill in, create different bloom times throughout the season. And then as the situations change, like for example, in that photo, you see the bleeding heart. When it gets really hot in the summer, my bleeding heart completely fades away. It kind of melts away in the heat, but there's still other things that are there that are present, that are filling that space. So it's not blank. As many of you know, if you have a blank space, something will grow there. And so choose the plants that you want rather than let the plants just show up. And then I mentioned earlier, and I wanted to reiterate, if you do meadowscaping and you want to have wildflower meadow, encourage you to start with fresh ground. Maybe it's sheet mulching this year and planting next year, but don't just try to let the lawn go wild or throw some wildflower seed on top of lawn. That doesn't work very well. Start with fresh ground and start with the plants that you want. Yeah, I think that covers, I think I covered all of the things I wanted to say there. Yeah, and like I said, be realistic about the care you're going to give and get those plants off to a great start. In the next slide, I just wanted to highlight, there are some great native plant resources. This is a poster from BES, Portland BES. I love this poster because it shows the different canopy layers. So the trees at the top, shrubs in the middle, ground cover herbaceous plants at the bottom, and then wet soil on the left and dry soil on the right. These are some of the most common locally native plants. These are going to be the plants that you encounter at nurseries. They're most readily available. And many of these are pretty adaptable as well. So this is a great resource for you to look for. If you sign up for Backyard Habitat, that comes in your resource packet, but you can look for it and get that free online as well. And then also, before we switch to the next slide, I wanted to just shift gears really briefly and say that I think we would be remiss if we didn't also mention TEC, which is traditional ecological knowledge. For habitat restoration. This is basically indigenous knowledge. This is really important understanding around healing the land and nurturing our connection to land, to plants, to the animal worlds. I would encourage you, if you don't know anything about this, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she is referenced in our resources. She released a book recently called Braiding Sweetgrass. It really gets into some of the cultural context of indigenous relationship to the land and how that knowledge is really important for helping to heal the land and to heal our connection to the land. And I would encourage you to listen through her words about this concept, about this idea. I did throw up a brief YouTube video with her speaking around this and kind of explaining what TEC is, that traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous people. There's a lot of talk about that in recent circles around habitat restoration. But if you're interested at all in nature from a philosophical point of view, definitely encourage you to check that out. So that's all of the formal presentation. We are going to talk really briefly about some of the certification programs. So in the next slide, backyard habitat certification, that's who I represent here tonight. So really briefly, there's a one-time $35 sign-up fee. That fee gets you somebody like me coming to your house to walk your yard, look at your yard conditions. We leave a resource packet with you with coupons and some of these resources like the poster I just showed you. We write up a detailed site report based on the visit with plant suggestions specifically for your yard. After that, it's up to you to look at those 5 criteria: removing noxious weeds, adding native plant naturescaping, reducing or eliminating chemical use in your yard, adding wildlife stewardship and stormwater management features. Those are the 5 criteria. We encourage you then to just do what you want to do, what draws you in, what is appealing to you, what you feel like is most urgent or important or interesting to you. And then when you're done with those initial steps, you might be ready to certify. A volunteer comes to your yard, walks the yard, sees what you've done, might give you some more suggestions. You get to show off your work. You get a certification sign like this sign here with some other benefits and recognition. And then we encourage people to renew or upgrade after 3 years. Since 2009, we've had 7,400 enrolled properties. Those are homes, schools, other community sites, some commercial sites. That represents 1,800 acres. Almost 2,500 of those people have certified their yards, and at least 115,000 locally native plants. And I say at least because we used to only track trees and shrubs. We are now adding all the native plants. So I think that we've only captured a bit of what people have planted. We have expanded the program several times. We are now covering 4 counties. We go all the way out to Troutdale in Multnomah County. I go out to Damascus and Happy Valley and Clackamas County. We go over to Washington County now, Beaverton, Wilsonville, so all the way out there too. And then Clark County, and Clark County was a big expansion for us too last year. So hope you'll check it out and let me know if you have questions, and we're gonna go on to some of the other options for you guys.
Okay, everybody, we have one last poll for you tonight. So let me pull it up real fast. Okay, so our question, why are urban areas a difficult environment to grow native plants in? And our options are reflected heat, sidewalk safety or visibility, destructive wildlife critters, impaired soils and drainage, invasive species, or all of the above. So go ahead and drop your answers in there, and then I will give us all about 30 seconds more here and then share our results. All right, just about 10 more seconds. Okay. Nicole, any comment?
Yeah, it looks like you guys picked that all the above there, which all these things can be problematic, but I will say that go for it. Go for it regardless. Just do your homework and we can help you with that. We've given you lots of resources for that. So Anya, if you had anything else to add, that's what I would say.
I think you guys have heard me talk enough tonight.
All right, we're moving on. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I meant to say Anya, but I said Nicole, sorry.
That's all right. We've all got it covered.
Yeah.
So we'll move on next to Gray.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the National Wildlife Federation's Garden for Wildlife program and a little bit about our affiliate, the Association of Northwest Steelheaders. So the Garden for Wildlife program is very similar to the Backyard Habitat program, but it's on a smaller scale. And it has two main goals, helping wildlife and helping people. And this has been a program for about over 50 years now, and something that we are working on and pushing real hard, and it is one of my focuses. Next slide, please. I mentioned the Association of Northwest Steelheaders, and they are my other organization that I work with. So, and they're a state affiliate, and they're also a partnership with the Garden for Wildlife program. And they are an association of anglers who are passionate about angling and the preservation of the environment. We know that the protection and planting of native species within our backyards and whatever habitats we have helps down the line, especially with fish and water cleaning. And so everything you do in your own backyard habitat or garden for wildlife habitat sort of helps to support the steelhead population or the fish population. And that's something that the steelheaders are very passionate about, as am I. So this is a very simple 5 easy requirements to get your Garden for Wildlife certification if you're interested. So you can see up on the slide there on the top right, the requirements are food, water, cover, places to raise young, and sustainable gardening practices. And we've been talking about sustainable gardening practices all night long. This is a smaller, maybe not smaller, but it is a good stepping stone to the backyard certification. Unlike the other program, it's not a we come out and visit you or you re-up every 3 years. It's a one-time certify, and then you have that status from then on. And you can really certify any wildlife habitat. There's no size restriction. You can do backyard, a balcony. We have a lot of schools, farms, city spaces, worship spaces, museums. I really like the balcony one. The thought of having a certified wildlife habitat in the balcony is really great to me. It is inclusive and easy certification, and its intention is to provide a simple process to get you started into this. So if this is new to you and you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, this is a great program for you. All right, next slide, please. Perfect, thank you. So May is Garden for Wildlife Month and June is Pollinator Month. So this is a really fun time for us. Normally we would have our breakdown of $20 to register, $30 for the sign, but during this month we have a 20% off for Garden for Wildlife Month. And so it's $10 off during the month of May and June when you certify below. And if you are interested now, you can contact Morgan, my supervisor, and I'm going to put her email in the chat, and she will help you certify, and you'll actually pay for the sign. You'll get the sign for free. So it's parksm@nwf.org, and that is in the chat. So if you're interested, we'll mail you a free sign. And so this means you're only paying the $20 for certifying. So it's a really good deal right now. Anya was very impressive with her numbers. So I'm going to do a little bit of bragging with my numbers as well. We have over 4,100 NWF certified wildlife habitats. And that includes a lot of residential areas and schools. So we have 795 certified wildlife habitats here in Portland, and 66 of them are schoolyards, which is really fun and interesting and great for our program. We actually certified 2 new schools this year as part of our Eco Schools program. So we're really excited about that. And then I'm also going to put in the chat another resource for if you have questions or you'd like some more resources moving forward, the link to the Garden for Wildlife website, and all of these things will be included in our resource packet, but I just want to make it available now. And that is all from me on this slide. So I think we're going to move in to final thoughts and questions.
Yes, we are. So this is our final question and answer session. And I've been paying attention to the chat and I didn't actually see any questions pop up in there. But what I'm going to do is give you all an opportunity to raise your hands and you can unmute and ask questions. But first, I wanted to put in the chat an anonymous survey that we have that we would love for you to take. And there's a prize. So please check it out and let us know what you think about the workshop. And if you took it last time, please take it again. We'd like feedback from this session, and there are some new options for questions in there. So this is going to be a good time for folks to let me know if you have some questions you'd like to ask live, and we can have you raise your hand. You can put on your camera to raise, or you can use the little hand raising reaction. Let's see here.
If nobody has questions, we can talk about the great plans in the on the slide.
Yes, we can. We can also move into the resources for a little bit with Amy, and I can keep looking for questions in the chat.
All right, everybody. That wraps up the content portion of our evening. I want to remind folks that we are going to be around for an extra hour or so if you have any additional, more in-depth questions, or if you'd like help with your habitat worksheets that were shared during the last class. And then we'll go ahead and pop the link for that into the chat again in just a moment. But here on the screen is some additional reading material for you. These are some great reference books as you plan for your dream habitat when you're gardening for wildlife. And the links for all of these books are included in your reference document as well. And here's a list. We've put together an extensive list for you of references. And I will make sure that this reference doc, here it is for you again in the chat. And I just want to say, for those of you who are headed out and you aren't sticking with us for our next activity, we want to thank you for joining us. And also thank you so much to our presenters for their hard work and expertise in putting this information together. This session is recorded, so please feel free to share with any friends who might be interested in gardening. We want to make sure that you have all the tools and information that you need when you're gardening for wildlife. And feel free to contact us at any point. Here's all of our contact information. This is also going to be in an email that I'll be sending out tomorrow. So thank you to Morgan and Gray from the National Wildlife Federation and the Northwest Steelheaders, Amy, myself, and Eric with the Clackamas River Basin Council, and also to Lisa, Nicole, and Susie with the Clackamas Soil and Water Conservation District, and Anya with the Backyard Habitat Certification Program. And so for those of you who are headed out, good night. Thank you so much for joining us. And for those of you who are sticking around for our next activity, I will get that ready.